I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as President Zelensky takes his 5-point victory plan to the European Council in Brussels, we assess comments by his former head of the armed forces, now ambassador to London, Valery Zaluzhny, and get an update on how Ukrainian children are studying in bunker schools.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 17th of October, 2 years and 241 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley and freelance journalist Gabriella Wozniak. I started with the latest battlefield updates from Ukraine and Russia. So let's start in Kursk. Now, the latest deep state info suggests the main body of the Ukrainian position in Kursk has been quite severely dented from the west. So it was a very rough oval shape, if you like, and the sort of western side of that has had a big chunk taken out of it. Deep State also suggests that the Ukrainian lodgement that was a bit further, about 20 k's further west along the border, is still there, but is much diminished. Now, that contrasts with information from the ISW, Institute for the Study of War. They're suggesting that secondary lodgement, 20 k's west of Sudzha, has either entirely or mostly been closed by Russia. So differing views there from very opaque data. That is the nature of the business, I'm afraid. But the Russian counterattack there that we've been speaking about for a couple of weeks now has been having some effect. Otherwise, inside Ukraine, very limited movements anywhere, a tiny amount, very tiny amount of Ukrainian advance in the area of Toretsk, but most of what limited movement there has been by Russia westward, up and down the line, but particularly in the Donbass, around New York, Chasiv Yar, those are kind of areas of the Donbass, just north of Donetsk city, but not a lot of movement generally at all. Sticking inside Russia, or going back to Russia, I should say, there are unverified reports, but from sites that I trusted in the past, unverified reports that Russia's deputy commander of the Special Ops Forces Training Center, a guy called Colonel Nikita Klenko, was shot dead near Moscow yesterday. Now, it's alleged Klenko was shot, he was about 20 minutes away from the training center, having just returned from service in Ukraine a week ago. It's thought that yesterday around 9 a.m. local time, he was in a car on a dirt road in the village of Melinki when an unknown person fired a series of shots into the driver's side window of the car. He was said to have died on the spot, having been hit 8 times. Now, there was some very odd footage been put out, I think, by the Russian authorities. Well, it shows the car. There's no sort of graphic imagery. There's no dead body. You can't see any blood, but there's security force personnel searching the car. It then cuts to what looks like a pistol magazine lying in grass nearby. Now, it is a big if, we have no way of verifying the incident, let alone this footage. But if this is another Ukrainian special forces operation, or maybe some of the alleged partisans inside Russia, it seems odd to me that kind of caliber of individual would have the composure to mount and conduct such an operation and then mishandle their weapon such that the magazine release catch is pressed and the mag falls off, or that it fell off and the individual didn't notice it or pick it up. I mean, it can happen. I have to admit, I have to hold my hand up here. I did once have a full magazine fall off my C8 DeMarco in Iraq once when I accidentally pressed the magazine release catch, but at least I did know about it. I picked up the magazine and then pretended it never happened. Of course, it happened in full view of a load of soldiers, and I looked like a total knobber, but that's just me. So it does happen, but I was just a little bit surprised when I saw that in this case. Now, elsewhere, South Korea's National Intelligence Service said yesterday that it's tracking the possibility that North Korean troops are participating in Russia's war effort. This is South Korea's National Intelligence Service. They say they are coordinating with Ukraine's intelligence services. Obviously, Roland was talking about this, was it a couple of days ago? Anyway, sources in Ukraine's military and intelligence services speaking to Ukrainian outlets RBC Ukraine and Suspilna said that the Russian military is currently training over 10,000 North Korean soldiers in Russia's Far East and are preparing to transfer some of them to border areas near Ukraine in order to free up Russian military personnel for other rotations. That last bit there, that was the analysis of ISW. Now, yesterday, the New York Times said unspecified US military and intelligence officials, quote, expressed some skepticism, unquote, that a significant number of North Korean personnel were fighting in Ukraine, but said that they had, quote, little doubt, unquote, that North Korean engineers and observers are operating in occupied Ukraine and Russia, in part to build and operate North Korean-provided ballistic missiles for Moscow. Which, to my mind, that makes North Korean troops in Ukraine, Iranian ballistic missiles and drones being fired into Ukraine, and Chinese dual-use technology being used by the Russian military in Ukraine. Now, I don't think it's too bombastic of me to point out that that means China, North Korea and Iran are fighting a war in Europe. And Europe, the US and others, but principally Europe, seem to be holding Zoom meetings to coordinate weapon supplies and God knows what else. It's just extraordinary. You know, they are fighting a war in Europe. Anyway, speaking of the US President Joe Biden yesterday announced a $425 million aid package, the latest security assistance for Ukraine. This was during a phone call with President Zelensky. Of the $425 million, it's going to include air defense, air-to-ground munitions, armored vehicles, a load of other bits and pieces. A White House statement said, in the coming months, the United States will provide Ukraine with a range of additional capabilities, including hundreds of air defense interceptors, dozens of tactical air defense systems, additional artillery systems, significant quantities of ammunition, hundreds of armoured personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, and thousands of additional armoured vehicles. To which I say, that all sounds brilliant. I presume they're just in the final strokes of being built, because otherwise you could have promised it, months ago. Why leave it till now? The White House statement continued, just the last little bit. It says, the leaders committed to intensify security assistance planning alongside international partners in order to ensure that Ukraine has the equipment it needs to prevail. As part of this effort, in November 2024, President Biden will host a virtual leader-level meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, where the leaders will coordinate with international partners on additional assistance for Ukraine. Okay, so put those last two bits that I've been going on about. You've got China, North Korea and Iran fighting in Europe, and you've got Western leaders having a Zoom meeting and talking about international assistance. I don't think that's going to be terrifying Putin. On external support, the next one, Australia. President Zelensky has thanked Anthony Albanese, who's the Australian Prime Minister, and the people of Australia for defence assistance totalling just over $170 million US dollars. I presume that's US dollars. I didn't see it written as Australian dollars, so I think that's US dollars. Anyway, President Zelensky said, I'm especially grateful for Australia's brave decision to provide 49 M1A1 Abrams tanks for our defence against Russian aggression. We value our partnership with Australia and its meaningful contribution to achieving just and lasting peace. Blah, 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 blah. I thought it was an interesting use of the word brave, saying it was a brave decision. The wider context is Australia's been under the cosh a little bit from talking heads and gobs on sticks like me. They had a lot of Taipan helicopters recently that they decided to break up and physically bury rather than donate. I know there's a lot more to capability than just the equipment, but the helicopter does help. Now, the NATO defence ministers are meeting at NATO headquarters in Brussels today and tomorrow. Interestingly, this is the first time New Zealand, Australia, Japan and South Korea will be participating in a defence ministerial meeting. I think they've been there before, but only in observer status. Now, Mark Rutte, the new NATO Secretary General, said he's going to update President Zelensky on the, quote, considerable progress NATO is making on what we decided in Washington. Now, he said nearly $21 billion US dollars has already been spent, and we are in a good space on delivering the full $40 billion at the end of this year. I mean, that's quite a lot. There's quite a lot left. There's not an awful lot of the year left. Anyway, Mr. Rutte had a message for Putin. He said, we are in this, if necessary, for the long haul. Obviously, we want to be in a place where Zelensky in Ukraine, from a position of strength, is able to start talks with Russia. But till that moment comes, he can count on continuing support, and Putin cannot count on us letting go of that support. We will keep this going, and this is what we're all committed about. This is what I hear consistently in all my talks in the alliance. Now, I wonder, this is me talking now, sorry. I wonder, when he says it's obvious, his word, obvious, NATO wants Ukraine to, quote, start talks, albeit from a position of strength, I wonder if that's wise, because, Ukraine currently is sticking to the line, Zelensky is, their aims are the full ejection of Russian forces from Ukrainian land. Now, you might take a view that that's too ambitious, but that's where Zelensky is at the moment. And I wonder if Mr. Rutte has made a mistake there, maybe let slip NATO's policy, talking about Ukraine wants to be in a position of strength, able to start talks. So he's talking about talks. And when he says, obviously, we want to be in that place, well, it's not obvious to everyone, Mr. Rutte. Separately, there were public opening remarks by US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Mr. Rutte a couple of hours ago. They talked about the global coalition to defeat ISIS, some other bits and bobs going on this afternoon. Then after around 6 p.m. Brussels time, there's going to be a joint press conference between Mr. Rutte and President Zelensky. We'll bring you the details of that tomorrow. In advance of that, Mr. Zelensky right now is in Brussels, presenting his 5-point victory plan to the European Council and the President, Charles Michel. In a video message sent on his plane whilst he's on the way to Belgium, President Zelensky said, all European leaders will hear how our positions must be strengthened. We must end this war fairly. Now, after meeting EU leaders, he's going to meet top European Parliament officials and then have the ministerial level meeting of the NATO Ukraine Council, as I mentioned. Of the victory plan, he said this morning, we propose placing on Ukrainian land a deterrence package that would either force Russia to participate in real negotiations or could allow the destruction of its military targets. Now, this is interesting because, of course, we've been talking about what do these security guarantees mean, security guarantees for Russia. It is very easy to say, well, there's only one security guarantee in town, and that's NATO Article 5. I'm kind of very firmly leaning towards that position. I'm very happy to be talked out of it. Well, let me finish the quote, sorry. So Zelensky then said, it's the peace through strength approach, explaining that this peace through strength approach concerns missile packages obtained with the support of US, UK, France, Germany and Italy, although he didn't say what those missiles are. But if he's talking about getting guarantees from those 5 and maybe others to put weapons on Ukrainian soil to threaten Russia, as you say, the destruction of its military targets, well, how is that any different from where we are at the moment? They already have Western weapons that threaten the destruction of military targets. It's all to do with how far into Russia can they fire, etc., etc. So I wonder if that takes us on at all and what this peace through strength approach is, and if there's any real alternative to a security guarantee of Article 5. Anyway, I've asked more questions there than I probably answered, and my voice is about to give out, so I better turn over to Francis. You've been at Chatham House this morning. Who have you been chatting to?
Well, thanks, Dominic. To that in a moment, but like you, I just wanted to say I too find it simply staggering to see caveats being thrown around this morning about the involvement of North Korea, Iran and China in a war on European soil. If it looks like a duck, swims like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it probably is a duck. They are operating in theatre now, yet Western leaders seemingly have their heads in the sand, or should I say water, hoping that this issue will go away. It's quackers, frankly, if you'll excuse the pun. But yes, Dom, to Chatham, chatting at Chatham, it was a really interesting morning there. Obviously, the premier Foreign Policy Institute here in London. And it was former Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Zaluzhny, who was addressing those who were invited to ask questions of him and also to hear him speak. It was fascinating. Now, I should stress off the bat that this event was not off the record, nor was it under the famous Chatham House rules, where you can use the information that you've received, but not the identity or the affiliation of the speakers. But despite that, I thought he was more candid than I expected on certain points. I'd expected his speech to be quite diplomacy focused, given his new role as Ukrainian ambassador to Britain. But in fact, much of it reflected on his time as commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Certainly, the questions put to him did. He covered lots of different topics and got quite philosophical at certain points, actually. By which I mean reflecting on political and military theory. Indeed, his speech began by mirroring, consciously or not, Aristotle's famous classification of there being three main types of political systems. No longer monarchy, oligarchy and democracy, but today, for him, dictatorships, democracies, and Zaluzhny third category, those countries seeking to join the West, with Ukraine being in that third category. And I think he said that to underscore that the battle for Ukraine's full transition into being classified as a democracy is not fully won. It is being taken for granted by too many, and it is that is being fought for in this war. Now, he went on to underscore that Russia is fighting an exterminationist conflict and that one cannot truly make peace with that. Then talked about how, and this was my understanding of what he said, the West is naive if it thinks that Iran, North Korea and China are supporting Russia because they care about the war in Ukraine. Rather, it's because they want to defeat the West. Most of those officials in those countries, he said, couldn't have pointed Ukraine out on a map and may still not be able to. That's not why they are involved in this. They don't care about supposed NATO encroachment. It's for totally different political reasons. Now, turning to military affairs, he said people were wrong if they believed that the next phase of the war would represent the Korean War, say, of the 1950s. That way of fighting, he said, has gone and disappeared in 2023, thanks to new technologies. He referenced the articles that he wrote for The Economist and others, which called for new investment in advanced weaponry. We obviously spoke about that a lot at the time. He added, people laughed at me over tech. No one is laughing now. Then to perhaps the most interesting and important part of the speech, he said he didn't believe that the future of global security will be rooted in the models familiar from the post-Second World War settlement. He didn't elaborate on what he thought those new models might be, but I think it articulates the frustrations many Ukrainians feel about the failure of international bodies to prevent this war and indeed to ensure Ukraine's victory in it. Then he defined what that victory for Ukraine should be. He said, and I quote, "In simple terms, we need to regain three basic things: feeling of our own security, certainty for 100 years that nobody is going to attack Ukraine. Documents like the Budapest Memorandum will not work. We need security guarantees." And I support what the president has said about this. He then went on, "We need the feeling of unlimited development opportunities that will depend on post-war recovery. But can there be a recovery without security? And then lastly, the third thing, the feeling that we are in and safe in our own home." Now, what was very interesting there is there was no mention of absolute territorial integrity, which was deliberate, and he spoke more about that in the Q&A, which I'll come to in a moment. But first he wrapped up the speech by saying, "I'm not here to criticise the West and NATO. I'm grateful to them and their peoples. No one is indebted to Ukraine, but we should be wanting to avoid repeating the past." But as I say, Dom, the most interesting thing then came in the Q&A for me. And what he said in answer to this question that was put to him. So this is the question. Is there any definition in which Ukraine can win without retaining all of its territory? And I understood that to mean the occupied territories, including Crimea. He said, with an analogy, if it was me in my home and a neighbour took my garden, I would say that it was my and the neighbour's responsibilities, or their sons, to sort it out. Now that, I think, is not reading too much into it to say that he's suggesting that perhaps there will need to be some kind of peace, and then for the occupied territories to be given back to Ukraine in a longer term future. I've not heard that articulated by any senior Ukrainian official prior to now. So very interesting that. And as I say, he was using an analogy there. It may have been an off-the-cuff remark. It may not be representative of the official Ukrainian position. Indeed, I don't believe it is representative of the official Ukrainian position. But nonetheless, he is the Ukrainian ambassador to Britain, and he did say it in a public forum. So I thought that was extremely interesting. So a few other points that he made. He said he criticised how people were too focused on the battlefront without looking at the political role of operations like Kursk and others. Of course, we've always tried to draw attention to that on this podcast, but he said that too many people just look at the military context and nothing else. And I think he was basically insinuating there how important it is to see Kursk in the political context. He said that Ukraine is showing it's a prime mover and it is still fundamentally shaping military decisions. He said he hadn't seen the plans of the Kursk operation prior to it, but he also underscored that operations like that and the war more generally cannot just be seen in terms of strategy. It's also fundamentally about resources. And I thought that echoed what the interviews that we did in Ukraine quite often reiterated with Podolyak, Bogdanov, Danilov, where they said that really it's resources that are the key to this war. And too often it's focused on personalities of generals, of individuals, when it's those factors that are really actually what are making the biggest difference on the battlefield. Now, he spoke a little bit more about NATO. He said there are too many factors that could shape whether Ukraine can be in NATO. But for now, there seems to be no alternative in terms of security. And then he made this point, which I think is really important and often missed, is that he said that Ukraine would strengthen NATO. Now, that's not new, but what is he said it can help rebuild NATO's capacity, which it is going to need. And of course, I think what he's referring to there is that this war and the lack of preparedness has emptied some of NATO stocks, fundamentally. And he's saying that if Ukraine is put into NATO, then its capacity in terms of manpower, in terms of financing military equipment, etc., would immediately be replaced, and that Kyiv would play the key role in that. I think that's a very, very interesting argument, and one which may be extremely important if we do end up being in a situation where things become even more volatile in Europe in the longer term. He said, as a diplomat, he struggles to get people to understand the economic reasons for investing in Ukraine when somebody put to him what challenges he'd encountered. And then he was also asked about the recruiting of women and why women had not been conscripted into the armed forces. And he didn't say that the reality that there are 15% of eligible women are fighting in the armed forces at the moment, but he said that if it got to the point where there was a European war, like the Second World War, then of course they would. There was room, I should say, as well, for a little bit of humour. He was asked when he joined about what he'd learned from being a diplomat rather than a commander-in-chief. And he said that somebody had said to him, when he'd asked them what makes a good diplomat, they said, well, somebody, of course, speaks English fluently, German, French. And he said, that nearly killed me. And I should say that he was speaking mostly in Ukrainian today, and we've said before that he's currently learning English to a level of fluency, and he did speak in English at the beginning. But nonetheless, there was a little bit of levity in what was otherwise a very detailed and in-depth conversation, and one that I thought, as you would have heard there, had some quite interesting snippets. So apologies that was quite lengthy, but I think very interesting, and I imagine you may have a few thoughts, Dom, before we bring in Gabriella.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Just back on that point you made about the territorial integrity and asked about the definition of winning, and he said if it was in my home and the neighbour had taken my garden, it would be my responsibility or my son's to sort it out. I mean, was that bit in Ukrainian? Because there could be a lot could be misinterpreted if that was in English. Was that very clear? A, was it in Ukrainian, and B, was it very clear? Did he choose his words carefully? Because that is a very telling moment, I think.
He did say it in Ukrainian, Dom, and it didn't come across to me as something that he'd said in a panic It came across as reflected upon, and indeed he may even have made a reference to the fact that it's an analogy he's used before. Now, it may be an analogy he's not used publicly before, but he has in private. But nonetheless, as you say, I too thought that was the most interesting moment of the entire event. But you're right to caveat it. This is one of those situations where it's important to see the full transcription and to see if there was any miscommunication that could be said. But he did definitely make reference to it being something that future generations might have to deal with, and it being something that was on the question of territory. And I think that in and of itself is quite telling about possible shifts that have taken place over the past few months within the Ukrainian political fraternity.
Yeah, and just finally for me, I suppose we need to speak to our chums in Kyiv again, because you're right, he's new as ambassador. He's not had a career in diplomacy so far. He's been a soldier. But, as you say, he is the Ukrainian ambassador to the Court of St. James in the UK. So his words carry a lot of weight. And I wonder how much of this was him sort of riffing off the back of a Q&A, or if he's actually there to fly a kite, to put up some ideas and see how they're received, as in put up some ideas that's been requested by the Foreign Affairs Ministry or from Zelensky or what have you. I mean, we know they have not an absolutely hand-in-glove relationship, he and Zelensky. They're political opponents to a degree. That's why he's no longer Commander-in-Chief, we understand. So he might be seen as a person with gravitas to be able to bring this idea forward, but also a fall guy if it all goes wrong. I mean, you're not going to be able to answer it now. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, but we do need to tap up our contacts in Kyiv and see get the view there. But what's your thoughts on that, Francis?
My instinct, Dom, is that he didn't say it in his speech. It came in the Q&A, as you say, and that for me suggests that he wasn't flying a kite, that it was more something that he genuinely thinks personally. And there were times when he was speaking this morning where he said, "This is me, Zaluzhny, speaking," by which I think he was trying to then separate himself from his official role. But obviously it's very difficult to do that as an ambassador, of course many ambassadors have found to their cost over the years. So I think it is important to be cautious on this and not read too much into it. But as we've always said, it's as interesting what isn't said than what is said. And what wasn't said today was the usual line one hears again and again, which is that the future of Ukraine's security is determined by whether it can retain all of the territory that is legally its, including Crimea. That was not said at any point. And that in and of itself, I would posit, is extremely revealing.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you on that one. Thanks, Francis. I mean, it's going to run and run. Let's move on now, though. Gabby, welcome back to the pod, friend of the podcast. Gabby, you've written for us in the global health section of the Telegraph Empire. I mean, many of the times we've spoken about children, education and the impact of the war. You've done a deep dive on the most recent experience. You've written for us about underground bunker schools, something that David recorded an episode on. Now, could you quickly bring us up to speed on your work for those that haven't read or heard your journalism before, and then just set us a scene about what the latest situation is regarding education in Ukraine? Hello, Gabby. Welcome back.
Hi, Dom. Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to start, if it's okay, by thanking you and Francis. It's obviously been a difficult time here, and it's quite strange for me to be in the studio today without David. But I think you've really carried us and the listeners through this really hard time, and that's been a big responsibility for you both. And I just wanted to say I think you've done it with real grace. Yeah, for the listeners that haven't heard from me before, when the war broke out, or the full-scale invasion in 2022, I went to Ukraine to start looking at how it might be impacting the youngest members of society, how it was going to hurt young children and school-aged children. And I've been focusing on that since then. But this latest article I've written for the Telegraph Global Health and Security section has come about because there's been a growing concern in Ukraine among teachers and policymakers at the Ministry of Education and Science that the current arrangements for teaching at schools are not really working anymore. When the full-scale invasion began, at first schools closed immediately, and many quickly reverted back to online teaching, which they already had set up because of the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, some teachers were quite sort of pleased about the fact that was quite a simple transition. The children were used to learning online. They could quickly go back into that mode. By September 2022, the government wanted children to go back into school in person, and they announced that there was a strict condition for this, which was that schools had to have or have access to a shelter that could accommodate all pupils that would be in the school building during an air raid. So at that time I wrote for the Telegraph, and I found out that only about 35% of state schools for children aged 6 to 18 had a shelter at that time, and only about 23% of preschools, so those are schools for children aged 2 to 6. So there's a big state preschool sector in Ukraine as well, which is slightly different to what we have in the UK. So a lot of children were not able to go back to in-person learning back in 2022. But over the past 2 years, it's been nearly 3 years now, there's been a constant drive from the education sector to build more shelters in schools, like the one that David visited, and to improve conditions in these shelters. Because at first, often the shelters were simply a kind of cellar, and the children would go down, sit, wait, try and pass the time until an air raid ended. But these days, they've tried to make these spaces more comfortable. They're more like a proper classroom. They might have blackboards or electric boards. They've got Wi-Fi, so that perhaps the children can move down and try and continue lessons if they're not feeling too stressed. By May this year, about 58% of schools nationwide had access to bomb shelters. So that's a big improvement. But there was still a considerable number of children that have never returned to school since the full-scale invasion began. So those children have been learning online, or some of them have been able to do part-time learning and part-time in-person learning. So this is where the school perhaps counted up the students and said, right, we can't fit them all in the bomb shelter, but we can fit half of them in. So we'll let half of them come for morning lessons, then they'll go home and learn online. In the afternoon, the other half will come in and they take it in turns like that. That way everyone gets a bit of face-to-face teaching and also gets to see their friends, which is really important. But these arrangements are not delivering the same academic results as is expected in Ukraine. And the first big alarm bell was sounded in 2023 when Ukraine got the results of its PISA assessment. So that's the Programme for International Student Assessment, which is a very highly regarded metric of education achievement that is conducted around the globe. Now, it showed that from 2018 to 2022, so that's not even including full-scale invasion years, learning gaps among 15-year-olds were equivalent to 2 years of loss in reading and 1 year in maths. I think it's just come to the point where the ministry has said enough is enough. We can't achieve the high results for our students that we want to if we carry on like this. And they've basically launched a whole new policy called School Offline. It's very ambitious. They want to return 300,000 students to in-person learning by the end of this year. Now, the focus of this is the frontline regions, including Zaporizhzhia, Dnipro, Kharkiv, the kind of regions that are being attacked every day. And the ministry is investing millions of pounds, not only in repairing and constructing shelters in existing schools, but actually building whole new enormous schools, which have a very large number of underground classrooms. And these are the so-called underground schools or bunker schools. Now, this is very, very expensive. So far, this year, the ministry has already spent 2.35 billion Ukrainian hryvnia, that's about £45 million, on repairing and constructing shelters for 53 schools. In August, Cabinet Ministers approved another 5 billion hryvnia, that's £95 million, to construct shelters in 77 additional schools. But the ministry is still seeking an additional 14 billion hryvnia, that's £270 million, to create shelters to house about 80,000 children in 165 schools. And they think that with this, they're going to be able to accommodate another 150,000 children into in-person learning. Now, for the article, I spoke to a teacher and a school principal from a school in Zaporizhzhia called the Zaporizhsky Sohovium Collegium, which is one of the schools that is going to share one of the new underground schools once it's been constructed. And it's currently slightly behind schedule, but it's due to be ready this month or maybe next month. When it's finished, it's going to accommodate about 460 students and 40 staff. So if they do 2 shifts a day, that's going to mean about 1,000 children getting in-person learning each day. And importantly, if the air raid goes off, these children do not have to move downstairs or move to a different building. They are already underground. They don't have to move at all. They can sit where they were sitting in the first place and carry on their lessons. trying to stop these interruptions, which is another huge problem with learning online from home, is constantly being interrupted and having to seek shelter. That's going to make a massive difference. So those two teachers, Natalia Gutarok and Valentina Yezhova, were both very positive about this future. Some of them, Natalia actually told me that there are some students she's never met in real life who she's been teaching. In fact, sometimes she said she would be walking around in town and people would come up to her and say hello. And she realises that they are her students, but she's never seen their faces because they don't have their camera on when they're online. Kind of crazy if you think about that. There are 2.2 million children now in Ukraine learning face-to-face. That's a huge difference, isn't it? That's almost 1 million more children going into real-life school. So that means that 85% of all school-age children in Ukraine are now learning either in a blended format or totally offline format. So that's a huge achievement.
That certainly is. I was scribbling the numbers out. I was trying to work out, and you've literally answered it there at the end. So 85%, that is very impressive because, has any of your work touched on the psychological impact of this model of schooling? Let alone the absence of daylight, but just the whole context of why are we in a basement and all that kind of stuff. It must be having an effect. I wonder if you've come across that at all. And how long do you think it would be before the 15% actually can get into either blended or offline / face-to-face learning, do you think?
Well, in terms of the kind of psychological impact, I think this whole strategy is about weighing up pros and cons, isn't it? But overall, the top priority is always safety. That's the number one thing. And really, a child being underground all day in a country that, a bomb can land anywhere at any time is the safest option, other than leaving the country. You have to remember also that these schools we're talking about are in regions where if a bomb is launched, it really just takes a matter of minutes before it can land in the country. There's not much time to run to a shelter. Being underground, it sounds like a sort of dark place, but they have designed these schools in consultation with UNICEF. They're all being built to a certain standard, so they must have really good ventilation. They must have a backup power supply so that if there's a power shortage, which there will be over the winter for sure, because the Ukraine's power services have been attacked multiple times, they've got a backup. They're not going to be in the dark underground. They also will have breaks. They're not going to be underground all day long. The main plan is for them to just do half a day and then to be able to come out again. However, they will be with their friends because you've got to balance the problem with learning online at home on your own and how lonely that is, and how children, especially teenagers who have a lot of hormones racing around their bodies, need their peers to be able to talk to if something's going wrong, if they're having a bad day. It's all about balancing these pros and cons. In terms of how long this might take, I feel like, sadly, they won't meet this goal by the end of the year. However, I am impressed that they have managed to sign off so much money so quickly, especially I know that earlier this month you were talking about the budget in Ukraine, and 40% of it is going to defence. There's not a lot of money kicking around for education, but they are so focused and so determined. I just think it's kind of mad, isn't it? Like, they're always looking for the next solution, and if the solution is to build an enormous school with a huge underground area, they're doing it.
Gabby, thanks so much for your time today and for going into a deep dive on this underexplored subject, and I'll get to that aspect of it in a moment. I wanted to ask, though, we talk a lot about the public investment here, but you and I, before we came on air, were talking about there's also private investment in education in Ukraine. I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about the form that's taken. So
the education sector in Ukraine is largely state-funded. In the early years sector, there are some private nurseries. One reason why I came to the story is because a woman who I know who runs 4 private nurseries in the Lviv region, Solomia Boykovich, she was telling me that she had decided to build her own large purpose-built nursery, which has a giant underground gym, specifically so that parents will send their children to preschool, because this is one age range where we're seeing low attendance of children. So there was some research done by UNICEF this year that said that 62% of Ukrainian children under the age of 6 are not attending kindergarten. 31% only are attending in person. 2% do a blend of online and offline, and 5% watch online classes. Now, I'm sure, can imagine the difference between a 3-year-old watching an online class and a 13-year-old watching an online class. Children at that age just do not learn well from a flat screen. They learn through play, through touch, through real objects and real interactions. So that's part of the problem, is that online is not really an option for that age of child. The other problem is parental fear. I can completely be sympathetic to a parent who does not feel comfortable sending a 3 or 4-year-old child to a school when there could be air raids, and children are so attached to their parents and they can get very frightened. Also, the other thing is that a lot of parents misunderstand the real vital importance of early age education, because the skills you learn at that age will help you out in the future. So Solomia is trying to create this opportunity by building this school, which she's got funding from another parent, actually, a private investor, to help her build it. And when it's finished, it's going to have enough space for 150 children. The other important thing is that it sounds really strange, but nap time is very important at this age. And in Ukraine, in the curriculum for this age of child, for preschool children, it actually stipulates that children must have a nap between 12 and 2 p.m. And in most public preschools, they even have dorms, and each child has their own individual bed. It's very sweet. They have little bunk beds. This has been a problem during air raids, because if children are asleep, you cannot carry 10 3-year-olds into a bunker, and anyone who has a 3 or 4-year-old knows they do not like to be woken up. So she got around that problem earlier in her settings by actually moving the sleeping areas downstairs. But then if you're creating a sleeping area downstairs, and then all the other children have to come because there's an air raid, it's just not ideal. So this large facility gives her the opportunity to create a space for children to sleep in their nap times, where they're not going to have to get woken up if there's an air raid. So it might sound kind of trite in the greater scheme of things, but these are the kind of considerations that you have when you're looking after young children.
It's really interesting. Thank you. And just a couple more questions from me. What else is going on to try and boost education in this very unusual period?
There are a section of children who have left the eastern regions of Ukraine, moved to the west where it's safer, who are choosing not to go to school in person. So there are actually schools that have places that are open and are safe to go to, or safe enough to go to. However, the child would prefer to stay and learn at their old schools, so perhaps they're dialing into a school in Dnipro. Earlier this year, the government was thinking about making it compulsory for those children to actually attend school in person. I got an update on that yesterday from one of the ministers at the ministry, and he actually said that they've decided not to make it compulsory, but they really are in kind of encouraging areas controlled by the government of Ukraine to make children go into school in person, because it will make such a difference to them. Now, this is slightly different to what's been happening, for example, in Poland, where there are many refugee children also learning online, still dialing into Ukraine to their Ukrainian schools. In Poland, from September, there was a change in the law that said that those children needed to register with a Polish school. If they didn't, they're not going to receive a kind of benefit that they can claim, or their parents can claim. So there's been a huge kind of push and drive to get children back into school in all these different areas, even outside Ukraine. However, obviously, there are still children that are not going to be able to go back to school, hundreds of thousands of them. And for these children, the government continues to try and provide digital learning equipment, laptops. They've also built digital learning centres that are public spaces where children can go to use devices and learn online. And these facilities have bomb shelters and a teacher, so there's kind of another sort of halfway house approach. The ministry's opened more than 150 of them so far, and many of them are in the frontline regions again, but there's still another 100 under construction.
I'm really glad we could get into this, because I know if David was still here, he'd be really finding this so interesting and so important for us to cover in the detail that you have. So thank you. One final question from me. Since we're on the subject of children, it would be remiss of us not to mention the kidnapped children. Lord Ashcroft wrote for the Telegraph this week on this subject, saying how, and I quote here, "Time is of the essence. If the international community fails to act, we risk losing an entire generation of Ukrainian children to a regime intent on erasing their identity." There's also been a new report just published by Freedom House and others emphasising the ways in which the Belarusian regime is also actively implementing the Russian state policy of destroying Ukrainian identity through indoctrination and the re-education of children. We've reported on that in the past. But I've talked about in the past as Dom the degree to which it seems very surprising to us, given that we talk about never again and we talk about the horrors that children endured in the the Second World War and indeed civilians more generally, that this is not something that is at the forefront of the European consciousness, whether it be the peoples of Europe and whether it be the politicians of Europe. You're somebody who dedicates all of your professional time to thinking about these kind of issues. How do you explain the absence of international attention to children?
I think in this particular case, I genuinely think it comes down to priorities and pressure on resources. And this is a very, very difficult problem to solve. It depends on the age of the child. I mean, there are young children that have been, we believe, allegedly taken. There's like a lot of evidence to show they've been taken from, say, like a children's home into Russia and adopted. Organisations like the Ukrainian Regional Centre for Human Rights, they've dug up through open source research, they've found certificates showing transfer of children to new parents. They might even know where they live. They've used facial recognition through media reports to locate children. But how do they go and actually get them? And also, according to Russian law, that child now belongs to this parent. It's very difficult to do the paperwork to try and get that child back. And if if the state was the caregiver of the child in the first instance, perhaps it's different to if there's actually a parent knocking on saying, I'm the genetic parent of that child and I want it back. So that's the sort of first problem. Currently in the world, there are so many conflicts going on and there's so much competition for resources. Would it be cynical of me to say as well that this is not like a quick win, and in a year of many elections where people are trying to show that they can do great things and win votes, this perhaps is too difficult to crack? Strangely, Qatar has emerged as a kind of good guy in this story, and it's been working with the International Committee of the Red Cross and to mediate, and has managed to return some children. I actually have an alert on Google. I get updates about the situation every day, and every week you get sort of 7 children trickling back into the country. But at this rate, and this is actually a quote from Olena Zelenska, she said this speaking in Latvia in February, she said, at this rate it will take 50 years to bring the children back. They will not be children anymore, which is really quite chilling, isn't it?
Let's move towards final thoughts now. But just before I do, just on that, when you were talking about the impact on children and the way their brains are developing, and you referenced COVID, I just wanted to, if people want to learn more about this particular area, a very good friend of mine from Florida, Tannahill, she and a couple of her colleagues, Molly Colvin and Jennifer Linton Reesman, have just released a book called Neurodevelopment in the Post-Pandemic World, The Altered Trajectory of Children's Education, Mental Health and Brain Development. So it's not about the rights and wrongs of COVID and all that kind of blah-de-blah. It's about what happens to children's brains by being locked down. So the book's out now, really interesting, Oxford University Press. It's all about how the lockdown, or the effects lockdown had on shaping neural functioning on the kids, and what that's going to have, the effect that's going to have over their life. So just if you're interested in children's development, well, all of our development, but particularly the physical development of the brain and what lockdown, this emerging science, and Tannahill, she's right at the forefront of it. She's literally a brain surgeon. Yeah, I've been fascinated talking to her about what lockdown did to kids' brains and the effects. So great book there. Anyway, final thoughts. I'm usually going to jump in, if I may, as host, just to say thank you to Ksenia. I was called by the post room here at the Telegraph a couple of hours ago. I had a bunch of flowers waiting for me downstairs, which was absolutely delightful to go and receive. I've moved into David's desk temporarily here at the Telegraph Towers, just to get us over this period. Didn't want it to be anything other than, well, a place to talk with friends and colleagues and chat and laugh again and what have you. So I've moved in for a brief time, and we have got flowers on the desk. We still continue to do that, and I was delighted to be able to go and receive some more, and received a lovely letter. Of course, it wasn't for me, it's for the whole team. Lovely note saying, "Dear Adelaide, Dom, Francis and the whole team at the Ukraine pod. In Ukraine, we mark the 40th day after someone's passing. It is believed this day marks the ascent of the soul heavenward. In memory of the wonderful David on his 40th day, my thoughts are with David's family, with yourselves and all who miss him. Warm embraces from Melbourne, Ksenia." So, Ksenia, warm embraces back indeed. Thank you so much. They're lovely flowers. They're on the desk right now. I did, of course, split the bag when I was trying to open them, and I've tipped water all over me. I went all over Kerry, who was sitting next to me. It was an absolute car crash. But the flowers survived. They look lovely. And Ksenia, very, very warm wishes back to you. Thank you so much. Francis, final thoughts, please.
Well, thanks, Dom, and thanks, Ksenia, for the flowers. They're really, really beautiful. We've mentioned acts of resistance, big and small, in the occupied territories this week, and I wanted to end with a story that serves as a reminder of that fact. The Memorial Support for Political Prisoners project has initiated an urgent appeal to ensure that Denis Naurovsky, the young Crimean who could see himself being sentenced to life imprisonment for supposed state treason because he refused to fight against Ukraine, has a lawyer. It will soon be 2 years since the 31-year-old, who's a former car mechanic, was first imprisoned. He was mobilised in September 2022 and appointed commander of a motorised rifle squad. He left that unit in occupied Sevastopol 5 days later, and with help from his mother moved from one place to another for several months before he was arrested in January last year. He didn't deny going on absence without leave, stating that he did not want to serve in the military and take part in the special military operation since its aims were not clear to him. And then he later wrote, "The situation is as follows. I'm not prepared under any circumstances or conditions to fight against Ukraine. I did not leave Crimea when there was a chance, and I now regret this. Yes, I have a Russian passport and I was mobilised, but I fled from the military unit to which I was sent." Now, you might be wondering, what good is it having a lawyer when the verdict is predetermined in advance? But lawyers can be vital for communicating with the family and indeed for the outside world. So I wanted to raise attention of that case. There'll be links in the show notes to those who are interested in it. And we will continue to draw attention to cases like this of individual bravery in the face of what can otherwise seem just a relentless onslaught of misery. So we will, as I say, keep drawing attention to such cases. It just feels more important now than ever.
Thanks, Francis. Gabby, the guest always has the last final thought. You're, of course, much more than a guest. You're part of the family. But what are your final thoughts, please, Gabby?
Oh, thanks, Dom. Well, I just love the sound of that book. I'm going to have to get a copy. So I think it's fitting to perhaps give an example of how children's brains might be changing in Ukraine as a result of the war. So as part of this article, I spoke to a 15-year-old called Eva, and she studies in one of the subway schools in the metro in Kharkiv. She's much happier studying underground there. If people want to read the full story about what it's like down there, they can. But when I asked her why she liked it, she said that she feels safer. Before, she used to study on her own in her flat. And I said, oh, what would you do if there was an air raid? And she said, during an air raid, if the explosions were loud, I would go to the corridor. If it wasn't that loud, I would stay in my room. I feel that's quite sort of revealing about a state of mind there, that a 15-year-old thinks that they can judge safety by the sound of the volume of an explosion. And I don't think that's anything that anybody really wants to hear from a 15-year-old.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk, We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.